So anyway, this was not my idea. Rabbi Wiener himself wanted, after we had finished Homer Devorah, to go through an overview of Nach. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to work, how much, we're certainly not going to read it pasuk by pasuk. But if I could give a little self-commercial, some of you might be familiar with the website Kol HaLashon, which has gazillions of shiurim on it. So actually, over the past 2.5 years, I have given a share in Nevi'im and Kesuvim, which, Baruch Hashem, right before Shavuos, we finished. So really, you can get a share on every perek from the Sefer Yoshua, perek Aleph of Yoshua, until the end of Divrei Hayamim. That's mamish all of Nevi'im and Kesuvim. So you can actually see a video of every perek, B'ezras Hashem. And they want me to do it for the Chumash itself, which is really Pashat Pshat. It's unusual. It's like mamish Pashat Pshat of Chumash, which may or may not be useful for you, but I think it is Kedai. Anyway, so that actually does pasuk by pasuk by pasuk by pasuk. So if you want to hear a shir on the pasuk, you can go there. We're not going to be able to do that because that would take quite a few years. But we'll really cover this outside. But I will read some psukim inside because of the particular lessons that we will learn. But today I just want to give a little bit of an introduction. Everyone knows the concept of Tanach, which is the abbreviation for Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. There is a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that the Rambam paskins lahalacha that a person is obligated to divide their Torah learning into 3 groups. A third of their Torah learning should be Torah shebichsav, which includes Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. So a third would be Tanach. A third would be Mishnah, and a third would be Talmud. Now, when you normally hear the word Mishnah and the word Talmud, you automatically think Mishnah and Gemara. Talmud is essentially the name for the Gemara. But that really can't be because this is a Brisa. At the time the Brisa was written, there was no work that was called Gemara or Talmud. See, this is the kind of mistake that we make, because obviously the Talmud, the Gemara, was finished by a certain date, and yet there are references to Gemara or Talmud that are earlier than that date. So what is it referring to? It's not referring to the books that we call Talmud Bavli or Talmud Yerushalmi. So really you have to understand the idea that Mishnah and Talmud refer to 2 different ways of learning the oral law. Mishnah would be the Bekias, the basic information of the oral law, and Talmud is the analytical idea of delving into reasons. So today it may indeed correspond to Mishnah and Gemara, but that was not the original meaning. So Bekitzer, what the Brisa is saying is, you have to divide your Torah learning into 3 groups. A third of it would be Tanakh. A third of it would be the basic rules of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which they might be halacha. So Mishnah would actually correspond to halacha. And a third of it should be in-depth understanding of the reasons and the svaras that could either be today through Gemara or it could be through in-depth learning of halacha. Meaning, you have to understand that the category called Mishnah and Talmud did not refer to books so much as it did to a certain methodology of how you learn the material. Now, the Rambam himself paskins this way, and then the Rambam says, however, Bameh Devarim Amurim, when are you obligated to divide your Torah learning into 3? That's before you have mastered it, meaning when you're in the beginning stages of your learning, but once you have mastered the Torah Shebichsav and the Mishnah, then you should spend all of your time in in-depth study and the like. Now, the truth of the matter is, most of us never reach that other level. So the big question is, it would appear from both the Gemara and from the Rambam that we should spend a third, we should divide our Torah learning in thirds. And that doesn't even deal with the other things that we learn, whether it's Musar or Hashkafa or whatever it is. So the Rishonim already noted that the prevailing minhag in Klal Yisrael was not to divide their Torah learning into thirds. And in fact, indeed, in yeshivas commonly, people spend the overwhelming majority of their time on Gemara, whether it's Bekias or whether it's Eon, whatever it would be. So a defender of the minhag, you see that the minhag of not learning Nach was so widespread already in the time of the Rishonim. Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, came up with a lumdus that when you learn Gemara, you fulfill all three requirements. Because in the Gemara, there are psukim that are quoted, there are mishnayos that are stated, and then there's in-depth understanding. And therefore, Rabbeinu Tam wanted to be Mechadesh. By learning Gemara, you are Makayem all of the three chalakim of Torah. And he even said, B'derech Drush, and obviously this is homiletical, that the reason Talmud Bavli is called Bavli is not only because of the Babylonian Talmud, but because Balul is a mixture, that the Gemara is a mixture of Torah Shebichsav, Mishnah, and in-depth learning. It's Balul with everything. Of course, the kasha on that is, the same could be said for the Talmud Yerushalmi. So, obviously, the simple meaning is Talmud Bavli is the Gemara of Babylonia, and Talmud Yerushalmi is the Gemara of Eretz Yisrael. But Rabbeinu Tam wanted to say that the Talmud Bavli is Balul from all three, and therefore you're Yotzei everything, right? So that's well-known phenomenon that often people will only know a pasuk because the Gemara mentions it. Oh, I know that pasuk from the Gemara in Chagiga. Or what's even worse is they only know the Gemara in Chagiga because it's mentioned in the Hakdama of Rebbe Kiv Eger. So they don't even know the Gemara. They only know the Gemara from an Acharon who mentions the Gemara, who mentions the pasuk. So you see already from the time of Rabbeinu Tam, if not earlier. In fact, Rabbeinu Tam was not Mechadish. Obviously, Rabbeinu Tam is dealing with a minhag that was already nafutz, that people were not Isaac in Nach. And yet, the Achrayim, both the Rishonim and the Achrayim, say that it is a big chaval that one should, even though it may be true that we're Somech and Rabbeinu Tam, not to take a third of our time to learn Mikra, but nevertheless, one should take time to learn Mikra. The Vilna Gaon talks about this a lot, and the idea that you simply ignore it is a big chaval. Now, so one source for the idea of learning Torah Shebichsav, or Mikra, is the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that you should divide your Torah learning into three. A second source to consider is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Now, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos talks about the developmental stages in Jewish education. And it says when you're 5, you should start learning Chumash, and that includes Tanach, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim. Ben Chumash LaMikra. Then it says Ben Eser LaMishnah. You start learning Mishnah when you're 10. That means the ideal chinuch system that Chazal promulgated was you spend 5 years where all you're focusing on is Chumash, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim. That's all you're doing. Only when you're 10, now if you've learned Chumash and Nach for 5 years, you can know it pretty well. Then you progress to Mishnah, the foundations of Torah Shebaal Peh, and you do that for 5 years. And you don't start in-depth learning of what we would call Gemara till you're 15. Meaning, unlike and once again, modern chinuch typically does not follow that, right? Modern chinuch will start teaching kids Gemara at the age of 10. When in fact, Pirkei Avos says that before you even learn Gemara, you have 5 years of Chumash. Or actually, when I say Chumash, I mean that includes Nevi'im and Kesuvim. Mikra. Mikra is not the same as Chumash. Mikra is all of Tanakh. 5 years of Mikra and 5 years of Mishnah. Imagine what your Gemara learning would be like if you had 10 preliminary years of learning Tanakh and learning Mishnayos. And then you learn Gemara. That was Chazal. Now, once again, that was a minhag that's largely ignored. The Zilberman Cheder system tries to bring it back, and I think it's a wonderful thing. I honestly don't understand why that's not universal. I really don't understand, because it's very successful, and it produces people who know Tanach and know Mishnayos very well before they begin Gemara, and it also creates a lot of enthusiasm. Why shouldn't it be universal? I really don't understand it, because it is the minhag of Chazal, and this was endorsed by Maharal was very, very critical of the fact that yeshivos deviated from it, and it was also the hanhag of the Vilna Gaon. In fact, Zilberman, a lot of it is based on the minhagim of the Gra. So, I think it's great. I mean, the problem with Zilberman is simply the fact that given the fact that it's not universally adapted, so it's difficult to transition from the Zilberman system to a yeshiva gedola. But that's only a problem because it didn't become the universal system. If it would become the universal system, there wouldn't be a problem of transition. So in a sense, Zilberman is stymied a little bit by the fact that not everybody is doing it. But if you ask me the question, why doesn't everybody do it? I don't know. It seems to me the ideal chinuch. Now, it may be, I as a parent do have to worry about transitions. So I'm kind of stuck. But if I as a parent would have to choose the ideal chinuch, it seems to be the ideal chinuch. So we have two different makayres on this idea of the importance of learning nach. One is the chiyuv of dividing your Torah learning into three. The other is the sequence that Chazal indicated about the strong foundation you need to have before you progress to Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, let me just point out that Baal Tshuva institutions do face unique challenges, which may justify why we don't do what Pirkei Avos says. Let's say a guy comes to yeshiva. The Pirkei Avos says, when you start learning at 5, we should give you 5 years of Chumash and Nach, and then 5 years of Mishnah. And after 10 years, when you're 15 years old, now you're ready for Gemara. That's the ideal system of Chazal. That was the system that the Maharal advocated. That is the system the Gra advocated. That's Zilberman. Is that the common system that's done? No, it's not, but this is the system. Now, but let's say that works very well if you come in and you start learning at 5 years old. What if you start learning at 25 years old? What if you show up in Or Samayach and you're whatever it is, 20, 22 years old, whatever it would be? So what are we supposed to say? Well, if you stay here for 10 years, we promise that we'll start learning Gemara with you. Meaning, the first 5 years, only Chumash. The next 5 years, only Mishnah. Meaning, when people are starting late, and they're not going to be willing to give us, 15 years, so what are we supposed to do? So, in truth, yeshivos that take people in who didn't begin learning till later are operating under state of emergency rules. We're operating under martial law, meaning we got to do things faster than we ought to do them. We have to cut corners. We have to bring a person up to a certain level of proficiency, even though we haven't gone through all of the stages. And in truth, it is not the best way, but it might be the only way. In other words, basically, if you're going to be literate in Gemara at all, we got to start you with Gemara, because if you're not going to be here for 20 years, how are you going to have any proficiency? So, are we doing the ideal system? We are not. But in a situation like Or Samayach, where people come to learning later, we just have to do this because there's no other alternative. Because the emes is, as people say, Chumash and Mishnah, you might be able to do on your own. But if you don't pick up Gemara skills in an intensive yeshiva environment, it is almost impossible to pick them up by yourself on a part-time basis. And not that it is impossible, but it's very, very difficult. Meaning Gemara, as you know already, is a very labor-intensive limud. It requires a great deal of time. It requires a great deal of full-time commitment. So the ideal environment for learning how to learn Gemara is a full-time yeshiva program. And therefore, if we got you for only 2 years, it wouldn't be kedai to say, let's learn Chumash for 2 years. It still would be learning, but it wouldn't be the best use of the time. So we push Gemara, although we do add other things as well. But you do have to understand that that's not the optimal system. And when Be'ezras Hashem, you have your children, and you're going to begin them with chinuch at a young age, I think the Zilberman type of chinuch is a very, very excellent thing to consider. So we have two different ideas, two different makoros, why the learning of Nach is important. One is the chiyuv of dividing in three. The other is the sequential building block model of education that Pirkei Avos gives us. Yeah.
Would the Rambam or this understanding make room for things like Musar?
Yeah, so once again, the question is where does Musar fit in? Because if the Rambam is saying divide things in three, so presumably he would treat Musar, I think, as nichlal in Mishnah, because Mishnah are the basic instructions for life. That would include halacha, that would also include perfection of character, so the Musar would be folded into what is called Mishnah, yeah. Yeah. So the answer is, like I say, the answer is the Rambam himself said that once a person has mastered things, the Rambam says his main limud should be Eon of Gemara with occasional review of Mishnah and Halacha. So by the time the Rambam was a doctor, he already had achieved a fairly basic mastery. He didn't become a doctor at 22. He became a doctor in his 40s. So he had already been sholate on many, many things. Now, there is a counter text, which many yeshivas have gravitated during the year. And this is a Gemara in Brachos. I believe it was Rabbi Eliezer, who left a message to his Talmidim, and it said, Minu b'neichem min hahigayon. That means, hold back your children from higayon. Now, the word higayon is a bit of an obscure word. Higayon normally means reflection. Hegyon libi, the thoughts of my heart. Keep your kids away from reflection. What does that mean? Reflection on what? So Rashi explains, reflection was a term that was used for the limud of Tanach. Keep your kids away, at least from Nach, Nevi'im and Kesubim. Keep them away from it. Why would he keep them away from it? So he was concerned that if people got overly involved in the Torah Shebechsav without connecting it to the Torah Shebal Peh, they would be so interested, right? Because Nach can be very interesting. Many, many interesting stories, beautiful language. You could be caught up in narratives. You could be caught up in stories. You could be caught up in poetry, as indeed many people are. And you would no longer try to connect it to the Torah Shebal Peh and the Drushos of Chazal. So he saw a certain danger that Mikra can be Mosheches Halev, and it would take you away from connecting to the Torah Shebal Peh. So he actually advised people to keep away from it. And many have said that there was that mimer that was the mahalech over the years, why there was a certain distancing. And yet, what can I tell you? Obviously, this is not a complete truth, because look at the Mefarshim. Who wrote Perushim? Well, on the Torah, of course, we have Rashi, Ramban, the greatest of the Rishonim. On Nach, we have Rashi again. We have Radak. We have Ralbag. The Rishonim wrote on Nach. The same Rishonim who wrote on Gemara also wrote on Nach. Right? So it was understood that Rabbi Eliezer should not be taken as a prohibition, but it should be taken as just an idea that you cannot divorce the Torah Shebechsav from the Torah Shebal Peh. It should not become an autonomous thing. Remember, Christians and other, they use the Jewish Bible to prove all sorts of things. And unless you have the Messiah of Torah Shebal Peh, literal readings of Psukim can mislead you, can distort you, can put you in the wrong way. Now, we see this happened in more recent times with the rise in the 18th and 19th century of the movement that is called Haskalah. Now, Haskalah literally means the Jewish Enlightenment, although we look at it as a very negative movement. But they called themselves the Enlightenment. And the Jewish Enlightenment, the movement of Haskalah, just a little bit of history about Haskalah, really came in the aftermath of Napoleon. You know, Napoleon, who was conquering a lot of Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. So Napoleon's last campaign, in which he was defeated, was Napoleon tried to conquer Russia and topple the Tsar. Now, there was a big machlokas among the Hasidic Rebbe's in Poland and Russia. Should we pray for Napoleon's victory, or should we pray for the Tsar? Most of the Hasidic Rebbe's wanted Napoleon to win, because the Jewish people under the Tsar were extremely oppressed. They were poverty-stricken. They were harassed. They were confined to a small amount of land called the Pale of Settlement that they had to move constantly. Napoleon promised emancipation. Napoleon promised freedom. He promised civil rights. So many of the Hasidic Rebbe's said, let's daven that Hashem should give victory to Napoleon so the Jews would be freed from their oppression. The one exception who prayed for the Tsar to win was the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman, who lived in Russia. And he said, as bad as life is under the Tsar, under Napoleon it'll be worse, because under the Tsar we're oppressed. And we know that we have no connection to that outside world. We can't go to university, we can't own businesses, we can't own real estate. So we turn inward to Hashem in Limud HaTorah. If Napoleon wins and grants Jews full political and social rights, then so many Jews are going to leave the Torah, and they will try to pursue higher education, secular pursuits, wealth. So the Tsar destroys our body and leaves our neshamos pure. Napoleon will free our body and destroy our neshamas. So the Baal HaTanya actually said it is better for the Jews to be oppressed in this difficult environment. Now you know that obviously the Baal HaTanya's tefillos were answered. Napoleon was defeated in Russia. And in fact, it's interesting that this got Chabad into trouble, because Chabad became identified from that time on. Chabad became identified as supporters of the Tsar. So 100 years later, in 1917, with the communist revolution, so anyone that had been what's called a counter-revolutionary was in big trouble. So the whole Schneerson family were considered to be enemies of the communist government, etc., and they brought back these old charges and the like. But be it as it may, Napoleon did conquer a lot of Europe, and indeed in the areas that he conquered, he liberated the ghettos. And the Baal HaTanya was 100% right. That is the origin. Around then, as you have the Reform movements, but Haskalah and Reform are very different. Reform was a religious thing. Haskalah was essentially the idea that Jews ought to get involved in secular education, secular culture, languages, science, mathematics. Actually, it doesn't sound that bad today. It sounds like modern Orthodox, but okay, but this was Haskalah. Now, you have to understand that the Haskalah was a huge movement of different types of people. There were maskilim who were totally religious, and they were Talmidei Chachamim. But they were maskilim because they also believed in secular education and culture, and they thought they could incorporate it, just like the model of YU or whatever it would be. So not every maskil is this Russia that, you have to, curse and whatever it would be. There were maskilim who were from people. Now again, many of the older Charedim didn't like even those maskilim, but whatever it is, but there were maskilim were totally, from our perspective, they looked totally good. And then at the other extreme, there were maskilim who became kofrim, apikorsim. Very few maskilim were reformed because if you were, if you weren't from, you just became an apikoros. I mean, how would you be reformed? Meaning, all of these maskilim were raised in religious environments, and if they rebelled against it, they weren't going to rebel against orthodoxy to become reformed, but they became stam kofrim. Some of them became such kofrim that they even hated the Hebrew language, and they only wrote in German or Russian, and they didn't write about Jewish topics. They just became regular, secular people. So you have maskilim who were Talmidei Chachamim, and you have maskilim who were kofrim gemurim, and then you have other types of maskilim who were interested in a modernized Judaism, but they didn't like rabbinic, they were against the Gemara and the like. So one of the characteristics of many, many maskilim is that they rejected learning Gemara and the like, but they embraced Tanach and Diktuk and Hebrew poetry. And they saw in Nach the authentic Judaism, chas v'shalom, before it was corrupted by the rabbis. So in the 19th century, because Nach became the property, so to speak, of so many maskilim. I don't mean the extreme maskilim who were so apikorshus that they didn't even want Nach, but a large percentage of maskilim. So as a result, in the 19th century yeshiva world, Nach acquired a guilt by association type of thing, that if they saw you learning Nach in a beis medrash, they suspected you of being a maskil. Guilt by association. Guilt by association. And that is why, for many, many years, Nach, our own Nach, the holy books of Judaism, got tainted with negative associations. So what we've seen in recent decades, though, is we've seen a little bit of lahachzir atorah liyashna. The crown has gone back, and you find within the Haredi and yeshivish world, more and more and more svarim are written on Nach. To Chumash, you've always had commentaries, but even on Nach, in which they try to incorporate the Torah Shebaal Peh into the interpretation. So things are very different. Like when I was in yeshiva years ago, learning Nach was still a little bit of a suspicious enterprise. Today, Baruch Hashem, it's no longer that case. Just like today, you can learn Tanya, and no one's going to kick you out of, or Samayach. So you can also learn Nach, and no one will accuse you of being a maskil. But for many, many years, there was a guilt by association. It was a funny, funny thing that, what gives you the right to learn Nach? What type of guy are you, etc. Are you an apikoros? That type of thing. It's an amazing thing. It's reminiscent of the idea that sometimes negative movements take over very good ideas, and then they make it very hard for us to use those ideas. What do they say? They say that we lost Nach because it was taken over by the maskilim. We lost love of Eretz Yisrael. It was taken over by the secular Zionists. And we lost tshuva. It was taken over by the Balei tshuva. But in reality, Nach belongs to everybody. Love of Eretz Yisrael belongs to everybody. And doing tshuva belongs to everybody. Right? There's a famous Or Samayach legend about a Talmud of Or Samayach was introduced to the Ger Rebbe. And the Ger Rebbe asked him, where does he go to yeshiva? So the Bacher said, I go to Or Samayach, but he hastened that, but I'm not a Baal Tshuva. So the Ger Rebbe said, you're not a Baal Tshuva? Why not? What type of Jew is not a Baal Tshuva? Either you're telling me you've never done an Aveira in your life, which is, not that likely, or you've done Aveiras and you don't do Tshuva on them. See, we make a mistake. We think Baal Tshuva means, I was raised not religious. Every Jew has to be a Baal Tshuva. Right? So it's an amazing thing that the Zionists stole Zionism, and the Maskilim stole Nach, and the Balei Tshuva stole Tshuva, and now people who don't fall into those categories aren't connected. So we have to reclaim all of these things. And Baruch Hashem, at least with respect to Nach has been reclaimed in recent decades. Yeah.
Going back to the Haskalah movement,
Yeah.
does it tend to have a greater effect on the Litvish world than the Hasidic world?
Yes. In point of fact, Haskalah was a real serious problem in the Litvisher world, precisely because the Litvisher Torah world was a very intellectual world. That's what the Yeshivisher world is. Intellect, brilliance. And Haskalah gave an avenue and an outlet for that brilliance in secular wisdom. So as a result, it had many casualties in the yeshiva world. There were B'nai Torah who left the yeshiva world, and not just leave the yeshiva world, but also left Yiddishkeit, because they were nimshach after the Haskalah, because they saw a world of intellect, a world of culture, a world of wisdom. The Maskilim also had some very devious tactics. In Eastern Europe, in the 19th century, many kids were orphaned at young ages, and they were wandering the streets. They didn't have parents. The Maskilim used to kind of look for these bright kids, claim them, support them, and send them to secular schools. Rav Aaron Kotler was on the verge of being kidnapped as a child, almost kidnapped as a child. The Chavetz Chaim writes, Chavetz Chaim was orphaned. Chavetz Chaim was much earlier than Rav Aaron, 100 years earlier. Chavetz Chaim was on the verge of being raised. He used to give thanks to Hashem that he was saved. So the Maskilim were looking for bright, Jewish, poor kids. In fact, poverty was also a big pull. In the Torah world, Haskalah had a double attraction. One was the attraction of intellect and culture and wisdom and knowledge. And the other was that the Maskilim would portray life as learning of Torah as unending, grinding poverty. And with Haskalah, we'll give you a chance to have an economic success. Now that last claim was totally fraudulent, because many of the Maskilim were just as poor as the people learning in yeshiva, because still the anti-Semitism, you might be a very well-educated Maskil, that doesn't mean you'll got a job as a professor in a Russian university. So that was a little bit of false advertising. But the Maskilim did talk about poverty was one of their big attractions to people and the like. Now you are correct, among Hasidim, Haskalah had much less incursion, although there were casualties there too. And that's because you understand that Hasidus offered something different than intellectual stimulation. They offered certain emotional connections to God and the like, and therefore the attraction of Haskalah was much less among Hasidim than it was among the Litvisha. But among the Litvisha, it was a big thing. Korbanos. I mean, literally, the Rosh Yeshiva of the time spoke about Haskalah as a devastating plague that had many korbanos in the Torah world. Now, as I say, not all Maskilim were bad, but nevertheless, they were part of a movement that had a lot of detrimental aspects to it. The Sridei Eish, there were people who might be in the middle a little bit. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was a Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka. He actually was one of the Gedolei Ador. He was a great posek, a great Talmud Chacham. But there were many aspects of Haskalah that attracted him. He was interested in secular wisdom and the like, and he left Slobodka to go to Berlin, and he became kind of a composite figure of a Gadol B'Torah who was involved in Chachmas Chitzonius. Would I call him a maskil? Well, by some definitions, yes. Although he was a maimin and a great Talmud Chacham all of his life. The Alter of Slobodka said later that he had fasted like 40 days and 40 nights, that the Sridei Eish should not become a kolkol when he went to Berlin. This was kind of the idea that literally you lost great people. There was a great professor at Harvard University for like 50 years, Harry Wolfson. You may have heard of him. Harry Wolfson was like the world's, in fact, his field in Harvard was medieval Jewish philosophy, whether it's Rambam, Kuzari. I mean, this was his field. Spinoza later. And he had grown up from, and he had been in Slobodka, and the Haskalah kind of totally took him away from Yiddishkeit, even though he was interested in Jewish academic research. And he never married. It's interesting. He became a masmid in philosophy the same way you'd be he would sit 15 hours a day, over these different books and be medayik, etc. But he would be a casualty. He would have been an enormous Talmud Chacham. But the Haskalah was Meishachim, right? So again, we're not here to give you a whole history of the Haskalah. I just want to point out that one of the casualties of Haskalah, which Baruch Hashem was not a permanent casualty, is that Nach became very disfavored in the limud of Klal Yisrael because it was so much associated with the Maskilim. Baruch Hashem, we've kind of claimed it back. So I think hopefully it'll be useful for us to kind of go over the basic narrative of Nach. Obviously, these are holy books. These were written al pi Hashem, and if they were written al pi Hashem, there has to be something Hashem wants to teach us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is teaching us something, so we have to try to understand what it is we can get from these books. Even Rav Chaim Kanevsky, remember, every day he had his unbelievable Bekiah Seder. Most of the day he did Iyun and he wrote Svarim, but he had 4 or 5 hours a day that he devoted every year to finishing Kol HaTorah Kula. What was his Bekiah Seder? He finished Babli every year. He finished Yerushalmi every year. He finished Medrash Rabbah every year. He finished Rambam every year. He finished Tosefta every year. It's just unbelievable. Every year. This was like his 4 or 5 hour block out. I think he also did Zohar every year. And Mechilta, Sifra, Torah's Kohanim, right? Every year. But the very first thing he did every day was he learned a perek of Nach, Nevi'im and Kesuvim, every day. That probably was one of the easier of his assignments, but this is what he did. So until the very, very end of his life, every single day, there was a perek of this. So obviously there's a very important messages here. So now let me just end with the following. We commonly say there are 24 books of Tanach. This is the number that's always given. Chaf Dalet, Esrim. In fact, the Mikros Gedolos of Nach is often called Esrim V'Arba, the 24 books. So I just want to mention that the counting of the 24 books is not as simple as you would assume. So let's count them. The first 5 are the books of the Chumash, the Torah. Reishis, Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. That's 5. The next are called Nevi'im Rishonim, the earlier books of Nevi'im. And they are Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim. Now, please pay attention. In modern Nachs, we have Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Beis, Malachim Aleph, Malachim Beis. That comes from the Christians who divided the book of Samuel into 2 and the book of Kings into 2. According to Chazal, there is no Malachim Aleph, Malachim Beis, or Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Beis. There is only a big Sefer Shmuel and a big Sefer Malachim. As a result, therefore, what is called Nevi'im Rishonim are only 4 books, not 6 books. And the 4 books are Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shemuel, and Malachim. So the 5 of the Chumash, the 4 of Nevi'im Rishonim, so far you have 9. We then have what are called Nevi'im Achronim, the later prophets. And we start with 3 very big books, Yeshayahu, or Yeshaya, that's the same person, Yirmiyahu, or Yirmiyah, same person, Yecheskel. So that's 3. So that's 5, 4 is 9, 3 is 12. And then we have 12 books which are smaller books of prophets. Those are called Trei Asar, which is Aramaic for 12, but they only count for one. You'll see in the counting, they count for one. All Trei Asar is considered to be one book. That's why this is Enlightenment Conflict by a siyum, because the halacha is, in order to eat on Erev Pesach, if you're a bechor, you have to have a siyum. So the most common siyum is on a maseches. But if you finish a book of Nach with a perish like Rashi, you can make a siyum. So the smallest sefer in Nach is the book of Ovadja, which is only one perek. So the question was raised, can I make a siyum on the book of Ovadja? It's a book. The answer is probably not, because Ovadja is part of Trei Asar. So Ovadja is not considered halachically a separate book. You'd have to do Trei Asar. Now all Trei Asar is around 60 prakim, so it's pretty big. So the smallest full sefer of Nach is Megillas Rus, which is 4. So Lamaisa, there is a small book you can do, but Ovadja wouldn't be the one. So Trei Asar counts as one. These are 12 prophetic books that are very short. So Chazal were Koveya, we treat them as one book. So again, I'm losing my count here. So we have the 5 books of the Chumash. We have the 4 books of Nevi'im Rishonim. Then we have Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, Trei Asar, which are the 4 books of Nevi'im Achronim. So that's 8 and 5. That gives you 13. We now enter what is called the Kesuvim. And tomorrow I'll talk about what is the difference between Nevi'im and Kesuvim. But, right, so Nevi'im is divided into Nevi'im Rishonim and Nevi'im Achronim. We then come into the Kesuvim. So the Kesuvim, you start off with Tehillim, which is huge. Mishlei, Proverbs of Shlomo HaMelech, and Eov, the book of Job, the book of Eov. Right, so those are 3 big books. Then you have the 5 Megillos, which count as 5. That would be Esther, Eicha, Shir HaShirim, Koheles, and Rus. So that's 5. And then you have Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Hayamim Aleph and Divrei Hayamim Beis, but we have to collapse a few things. Divrei Hayamim is Chronicles. Aleph and Beis, once again, is of non-Jewish origin. So Divrei Hayamim counts 1. And even the division of Ezra and Nehemiah is from the Goyim. The Gemara says Beferish that Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. So you eliminate Nehemiah because it's part of Ezra, and you eliminate Divrei Hayamim Beis. So now, if you count it, hopefully you will get 24. Let's go over this just to be sure we have to count. We have the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, which is 5. We then have Nevi'im Rishonim, Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, not Aleph and Beis. So that gives you 4. 5 and 4 is 9. Then we have 4 Nevi'im Achronim, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, Trei Asar, which is 4. So that's 5 and 8 is 13. Then we have Tehillim, Mishlei Eov, which is 3. We have the 5 Megillos, which is 5. That's 8. So that gives you 21. And then you have Daniel Ezra, which includes Nehemiah. So that's 22, 23. And then you have Divrei Hayamim, which includes Aleph and Beis. So that's how you get 24, okay? So the point I'm making is, in order to get 24, you have to take into account how Chazal divided the books. Shmuel is one book. Malachim is one book. Divrei Hayamim is one book. Ezra Nehemiah is one book. Trei Asar is one book. The 5 Megillas are 5 books. They are treated as 5 separate Sfarim. So as a result, only if you follow Chazal's counting, you will get Chavdalet, and this is what Chazal point out. They also point out in the Navi Yeshayahu, when it describes the adornments of a Kallah getting dressed for a chasna, it uses 24 Lashonos of adornments. Chazal say that a Talmud Chacham must adorn himself with 24 kishutim, 24 beautiful adornments. and these are the Chaf Daled Sifrei Tanach. Okay, but it's important that if you count it the way we conventionally have it, which is based on the Goyim, you'll get much more than 24. So that's how you have to be very careful to understand how Chazal connected the different books. Yeah.
Are the Prakim also?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that, but I'll just say very quickly, the division of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim, even the Torah, into chapters, Prakim, is of non-Jewish origin. It is not our identity at all. We have Psuchos and Stumos. We'll talk about that. But chapters are of non-Jewish origin. Now, Sfarim refer to them simply because it's convenient. But Alibi DMS, they do not have a makor. Yaakov Kamenetsky suggested this is why commonly when people refer to Nach, they'll often say in Yiddish, kapitel, which is Yiddish coming from the Latin, capitulo, chapter. They will not say the word perek. They won't refer to it in Hebrew to kind of underscore that it's of a non-Jewish origin. This is what Rav Yaakov suggested. And that is why the fact that a perek ends in a certain place, sometimes in the middle of something, or sometimes the end of a perek is really very much the next story. There's nothing to darshan there. You can't ask a kasha why. I mean, you can ask a kasha on the Goyim, but there is no significance in where the prakim end or begin because they are not from us. So prakim are not of Jewish origin. That includes even the Torah. The only situation where prakim are relevant is Sefer Tehillim, which is divided into either 150, as we have it, or some say 147. We'll talk about that a little bit. Those are makubal already from David HaMelech. Even then, they're not really called Tehillim, they're not really called prakim, but they're called Tehillim or whatever it would be. So that's the only chelik of Nach in which you have what the equivalent of chapter divisions. Okay, we'll stop it.
Thank you for listening to this Samayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.